financial crisis really grew upon us over a period of 30 or 40 years as each day the financial environment changed. There was more and more innovation. Regulation changed, but didn't change with it fast enough. And there was no kind of sudden discontinuity until the crisis itself. And then, of course, everyone realized that banks were undercapitalized at that time. They didn't have enough liquidity and regulation needed to change, which it now has very substantially. And I think what I call the distraction crisis, which technology has brought upon us, is pretty much the same, although it's happened over a 10-year period. In the period when these technologies have become ubiquitous to every aspect of our way of life, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we educate ourselves, the way we shop, it sort of crept up on us and regulation has not kept pace. I do see a direct parallel with the period leading up to the financial crisis.
When we are looking for guests to come onto the show, there are a couple of attributes that we look for in the individual. They need to be high profile in their field. They need to be thought leaders. They need to be passionate about what they do. And they also need to have a story to tell. Okay. And this guest certainly ticks those boxes. Bob Wigley is the chairman of UK Finance. He sat on the board at some of the most esteemed organisations in the world. I'm talking the Bank of England, St. John's Ambulance, and many, many more. He's had a decorated career, including being the CEO of one of the biggest banks in the world, Merrill Lynch, at the time of the 2008 banking crash. We talk about his experience around that time and dealing with stress at the highest level generally. And we also talk about Bob's incredible new book, Digital Minimalism, which puts forward some really interesting hypotheses on what to expect in the future when the world is essentially dominated by a generation who have grown up with digital convenience and instant gratification and, having this external brain at their fingertips, what the cultural impact of that will be. This conversation is incredibly insightful and we cover some really interesting areas. I think you'll really enjoy this one. It's Bob Wigley. So, Bob, thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
So you're back in the office for the first time in a while. How's your day going?
Yes, it's something like 4 months. We normally have 180 people. There are about 3 people here today. It's the city. It's like a ghost ship. But I'm very glad to say that people are starting gradually to come back.
Yeah, well, we got to start somewhere, I suppose, in the recovery, haven't we? And hopefully this is the beginning of a non-lockdown future. But we'll see how that plays out. Signs look positive right now, though, don't they? So
they do. They feel this. I think they do feel positive. Yeah.
For the listeners who are unfamiliar with your work and the sort of positions that you hold and unfamiliar with Bob Wigley, can you just give us a bit of an introduction to yourself, your background, in sort of what you're doing now?
Yeah, so up until 10 years ago, I spent 25 years as a banker. I ended up running Merrill Lynch in Europe with 9,000 people in 23 countries and about $500 billion of gross assets on the balance sheet, which was about a third of Merrill Lynch's global balance sheet. Just before the financial crisis, the Prime Minister asked me to join the board of the Bank of England to help the Bank of England think about how to deal with what was clearly coming. Post-crisis, I left banking altogether. I've been for the last 10 years working with young entrepreneurs in tech businesses, trying to help them grow their businesses. And then about 3 years ago, I was asked to chair an organisation called UK Finance, which actually represents the UK financial services sector. And outside that, I do some philanthropic things with Cancer Research UK and St. John's Ambulance and the Royal Marines. I do some lecturing at Oxford and Cambridge. I'm a part-time professor at a university in Australia. And as you know, I've just written a book.
Absolutely, and we'll come to that in a minute. And that's part of the reason why I was so keen to get you on. I think your book looks fascinating, Born Digital. But I wanted to rewind back to the sort of early days, Bob. I believe you went to Bath University. Immediately, you was attracted to a career in business. You did a business administration degree, I believe. And then you proceeded with a career in that direction in the murky world of banking. So talk us about that little journey in the first half of your career.
Yes, well, what got me into that actually was the inspiration for that was Mrs. Thatcher, in fact. So when I was 16, I took part in something called Young Enterprise at school, and I won the national competition. And when I was 19, I mentored some kids in a Young Enterprise company, and they also won the national competition. And on the way back from that competition, they said to me, look, you've had this great experience. We've had this great experience. Why don't we see if we can persuade every school in the UK to run a Young Enterprise program? How would we do that? And I said, why don't we write to the Prime Minister? And bear in mind, I was 19, they were 16. Anyway, so we wrote to the Prime Minister. And slightly to my surprise, she invited us to go and see her the following week. So we went to Downing Street, made a presentation. And as we came out, she'd organised a whole group of luminaries from the city. She wagged her finger at them and told them to make sure that there was a young enterprise programme in every school in the UK by the end of next year. One of the guys there, who was chairman of a bank, looked at me and he said, "You're obviously trouble. You better come and see me in my office." So I went to see his office, and I remember sitting there thinking, chairman of a bank, this is what I'm going to do.
Fantastic. That's a great story. So what were your sort of thoughts on Mrs. Thatcher when you met her then? What kind of impression did she leave on a young Bob Wigley?
Well, her private secretary, just before she came through the door, said, "You will have about a second and a half to attract her attention, or she'll just move straight down the line." And I remember she came through the door with these fiercely piercing eyes. And I nearly froze. Happily, I didn't freeze. Anyway, I talked. Obviously, I did attract her attention, and she was very interested. She was very businesslike. She just wanted to know what she needed to do to get this to happen. She loved the idea, and she made it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, one of the things we're probably going to be talking about now is distractions in this digital world and things. But Mrs. Thatcher, I've read a book about her, and apparently she was notorious for, like, when she was in this deep state of thinking about a task at hand, she was it was impossible to sort of to blink her concentration type thing. But she was known for having quite a short a short attention span for things that weren't relevant to what she wanted to do.
Exactly.
So I get what you're talking about there. You had that sort of 3-second window possibly then, yeah?
Well, the other thing that was obvious was that all the middle-aged men around her were absolutely terrified of her. So if she told them to do something, they got on with it.
Absolutely, but I can imagine she was quite intimidating though. But no, I'm sure you learned lots from that experience. And wow, you got a response within a week as well. I mean, that probably wouldn't happen these days, would it?
Well, I wrote to Theresa May when I became chairman of UK Finance and she became prime minister, and I actually never received a reply. I never received a reply the entire time she was prime minister. So that tells you how things have changed. I only represent 8% of GDP. Why would she reply to me?
I know. Whilst you were a student, though, it was possible. Well, it's remarkable how much the world has changed, I suppose, isn't it? But so talk us through the most important milestones in the first half of your career, maybe like hardships you faced and the lessons you learned from them. What kind of set you on this path in terms of, what you're doing now?
So I suppose it was, there was a time when you couldn't be a general banker. You had to go into an industry specialization. And I chose media and then ended up as the global head of telecom, media and technology at Merrill Lynch during the period 1998 to 2002. So that was the dot-com boom and the dot-com bust, if you remember. And that's really what sort of excited my interest in emerging technologies. And I've been following technology ever since. And it was that really that got me into writing the book.
Staying on the subject of the early days then, I can see you obviously had a very successful career. And then in 1996, you took this probably life-changing role of being a very senior member of the UK arm of Merrill Lynch, one of the biggest banks in the world. So tell us, what did you learn from being part of an organization like that at that time?
So I learned lots of things. I learned how different the US culture is from the UK culture. My job was a bit like being the UK ambassador to New York and the US ambassador to London all at the same time. I had to explain to each side why they weren't actually as mad as they might seem. The Americans were very, very focused on rapidly building a business in Europe. So we had to very quickly put a strategic plan in place to grow a business as big as Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs in Europe, and then ruthlessly execute that plan over a 6-year period. So, and during that time, we took the revenue from 3 to 6 billion per annum. We took the pre-tax income from 700 million to 3 billion. So it was a period of enormous excitement, growth, and of course, then the financial crisis came upon us.
This is the most important question of the lot, probably. Did they pay for you to go over to the US on Concorde?
I did go on Concorde several times, yeah. I mean, they didn't particularly pay for me or encourage me. It was actually BA who did that. I think we were the second or third largest customer of British Airways after McKinsey and the Ministry of Defence. As the person who bought several thousand business class tickets a year, used to get reasonably well looked after.
I can imagine. Well, my brother used to work for business for British Airways, and when he left to join a big defence company, I was gutted because of the staff discount on the flights. It was incredible.
Concorde was an extraordinary experience. I remember the first time I went on it, I actually had to go to a meeting which was held in the airport at JFK, and I left my house in the morning in Kensington later than I would normally leave to get on a flight to New York. So I was on, I think, the 9:30 Concorde. I got to JFK. We had a meeting and lunch. I got back on the afternoon Concorde, and I was back in my bed at home in Kensington at 10:30 that night. That was the most extraordinary experience. Yeah, really surreal.
Isn't it incredible, though, that you could do that then? When was that? That was in, what, the late 90s or something, was
Yes,
it?
exactly. Yes, earlier, I think, actually. Yes, mid-90s, I think,
So,
Concorde.
so
Yeah.
unless you had access to military aircraft, that would be impossible these days, wouldn't it? Which is
Literally, yes,
unbelievable.
absolutely, yes, it was. I mean, you actually arrived before you left.
Of course, I didn't think of it like that. So, what is the biggest cultural difference between Wall Street and the City of London then?
Well, I think what is that expression that Winston Churchill, I think, said? This was two great countries separated by a common language. Um, we have similar cultures in many respects. I think we both have huge roles in the world in terms of acting as the world's policeman and instilling a sort of a set of values. At least we did at that time, a set of values around the world. But I think you can't get away from the fact that Wall Street has a more financially orientated focus even than the City of London. I mean, the overriding, quarterly arms race, as it was called in New York, really drove everyone's attitudes at that time. Whereas in London, I think there was a more measured, perhaps slightly longer term attitude, and I think that was quite a striking difference.
Do you think the banks on Wall Street have a closer relationship with the central bank or the Federal Reserve than the sort of Bank of England and the relationship with the banks in the city?
I actually think the relationship has never been closer right now. I mean, the governor of the Bank of England at the moment was the guy who dealt with a lot of the issues during the financial crisis when I was actually on the board of the Bank of England. And I would say, obviously, the relationship went through a difficult period after the financial crisis when regulators felt quite rightly they had to change the way the industry was regulated. But I'd say right now the relationship is very close. We cooperate on a whole range of areas. Right now, we're doing work together to try and tackle economic crime in this country, which is a big issue, not just here, everywhere, but particularly a poignant issue in London.
Absolutely. So you were obviously in charge of Merrill Lynch in the UK. You obviously mentioned the financial crisis at that time. I think you left a year later, didn't you? So talk us through that period in your life then, when Lehman Brothers happened, and that period must have been very, very stressful for you, Bob.
Unbelievably stressful. I would say that for the 9 months of 2007 to 2008, I literally did not sleep. I mean, I slept fitfully, but not properly. And by the end of the period, when we were starting to come out of the crisis, I mean, the stress is a weird thing. When you're a senior executive in a big company, you think you get used to stress, but extreme stress over a prolonged period is very dangerous, and you don't realize because it sort of creeps up on you. And I would say probably, that had I not left banking at that time and had a break, I might well have become ill. It was absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. And it wasn't until actually I took my family away to sort of detox after the crisis. We went to the Galapagos, and I can remember diving into the sea one day, and I hadn't looked at a BlackBerry for a week because, not least because there was no signal in the Galapagos. And I suddenly thought, I've got my life back. And you don't realize what the stress is doing to you at the time. But afterwards, you look back and you think, I'll never allow myself to get into that situation again.
This is a really important point in terms of the book you've just read, actually. I tell you who got me into this notion of not working 24/7 all the time was my wife, and she called it digital detox. And she basically said, your phone goes into the drawer when we go on holiday and you do not touch it, just like sounds like you did in the Galapagos. And it is incredible, isn't it? Day one is hell. Day two is a bit better. And day three, you're kind of like forgetting about work then. And by day 4, 5, 6, you kind of like you are on holiday then, aren't you?
I think you go through a sort of literally a withdrawal syndrome where you start twitching, and then you go through a period of anxiety where you wonder when you go back to the BlackBerry whether anybody's going to be bothering to email you or call you anymore. You sort of feel you might have become irrelevant. Which is ridiculous because, of course, it's all there when you get back. But yeah, it is a very odd experience to completely withdraw from technology, but a very good one, I think, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we didn't evolve to, to have all this technology around us. Our brain is not ready for this, really, is it? This is just something we've sort of, which has been happening for the last 20, 30 years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms.
Funny enough, you're putting your finger on it, precisely the point which made me write the book, which is that the financial crisis really grew upon us over a period of 30 or 40 years as each day the financial environment changed. There was more and more innovation. Regulation changed, but didn't change with it fast enough. And there was no kind of sudden discontinuity until the crisis itself. And then, of course, everyone realized that banks were undercapitalized at that time. They didn't have enough liquidity and regulation needed to change, which it now has very substantially. And I think what I call the distraction crisis, which technology has brought upon us, is pretty much the same, although it's happened over a 10-year period. So, in the period when these technologies have become ubiquitous to our every aspect of our way of life, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we educate ourselves, the way we shop, it's sort of crept up on us, and regulation has not kept pace. And that's really what made me write the book, because I do see a direct parallel with the period leading up to the financial crisis.
Yeah, well, you see that now. Then you think that's what's going on.
Exactly. And I don't think a lot of people realize how their life is totally controlled by the. You just walk down the street when there were people in the streets, walk down the street, and you just watch people basically looking at their devices, which are telling them what to do and where to go. I mean, it's almost as if we're controlled by our technologies.
I completely agree. We've just got to draw that line, haven't we? I wasn't going to unpack this until later on, but I think this is a perfect opportunity. So you obviously talked about why you wrote the book. You must have done a lot of research in the lead up to this book.
Unbelievable.
You must have done a lot, yeah.
Unbelievable. So I read 35 books.
Including Carl Newport's Deep Work, which is why we started talking, by the way.
Indeed, which is a very, very good book, I must say. But we must come back to that at the end, because I think there are important points about what we are teaching our children to do at the very point where we need them to be able to deep work. And I think there's an inconsistency there. We should explore that later. But yeah, so I read 35 books. I probably then read 200 government reports and academic papers looking at the evidence of what technology does to us, both good and bad. And then I tried to distill it. And the way I was looking at it was that every parent I know worries about not just how much time they spend on their devices, but particularly how much time their children spend on devices. And I wanted to really understand, what was it doing to the way they form their personalities, the way they live their lives, and the way they look at the world. And what I discovered was kind of what I expected, was that Generation Z is so different from my generation. This is not like some small incremental change. It's a whole series of connected changes, many of which are either caused by, accelerated by, or exacerbated by technology. And a lot of people, I think, my age haven't understood. This is not some small change. Neither is it going back. This is the sort of thing, well, they'll get over it when they grow up. They'll be different. No, wrong. This is a once and for all lifetime massive change. And that's really the point of the book, is to try and explain that.
It's probably the most misunderstood thing in the world of work right now, is the generational difference, isn't it? I think, would you call them the baby boomers and Generation X, are probably still running the country, essentially. And we've got this new, I'm the millennial in the middle. I'm an old millennial, actually, just about a millennial. And then you've got Gen Z, and even I look at, I talk to people who are Gen Z, and I'm thinking, wow, you're totally different to the way I look at things. What were the kind of most striking things you found out from your research, Bob?
I suppose the most worrying was that during the 10 years that these technologies have become ubiquitous to every aspect of our lives, a whole range of factors, including unhappiness, loneliness, anxiety, depression, sadly, even self-harm and suicide, have gone up very substantially for Generation Z. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that is solely caused by technology, and indeed the academic evidence doesn't bear that out. But I also don't believe it's a coincidence. So I also look, by the way, at things like that have happened during the same period, like the decline of the nuclear family, the decline of religion, the decline of marriage, interestingly, the decline of communal eating. And what I suppose I concluded was that whilst it doesn't intend to do it, it's not some sort of great plan by big tech companies. Technology systematically attacks all the places that during my childhood and early working life, empathy would have developed. So starting with this, the face-to-face conversation, Generation Z prefers messaging to talking. They don't particularly want to have a face-to-face conversation most of the time. And the problem with that is, as I'm talking to you and I'm looking at you, if I say something you don't like or you think is rude, you wince and I start to change my tack. If I'm not getting those visual clues of feedback, then I'm not learning empathy. And what I discovered is that youngsters, really down to babies, are getting technology earlier and earlier in their lives, and they're using it for longer and longer. And this is having a profound impact on the way that we develop bonds and relationships with our parents, our peers, and it causes what I call stunted empathy growth. And that is perhaps why society is today more polarized than it's ever been.
Do you think it's also changing people's ethics as well? Because the reason I bring that up, Bob, is because one thing that you mentioned there, which stood out to me, was first of all communal eating. That's something myself. I got 2 daughters. We've just started doing this again. We didn't do it. They're only young. We've started doing it now and insist we at least have one meal together by the table as a family, which is probably quite rare these days, But the other one is religion. Religion over the last 2,000 years has dominated Western culture. And then all of a sudden, in the last 50 years, it kind of doesn't exist anymore, in the West, that is. It's very, very, it plays a minor role in, societal role, on a macro level, because, compared to what it used to be. And it just leaves a big void, doesn't it? When we're replacing it with our phone, we're replacing it with democratization of everything.
Correct. And actually, I have a whole chapter in the book talking about the what's called the rise of the nuns. That nuns meaning, when asked in a survey, "What's your religion?" and the answer is none. That's now a very substantial part of the population, particularly in the US and in Europe. Traditional religions have been very much on the decline. And I explore a little bit what has replaced that. Now, what has replaced that, interestingly, is a whole range of things, but technology gods are one of the things that have replaced it. So the whole concept of celebrification of influencers and the new internet celebrities, they've become a kind of new form of god to youngsters. The other interesting thing is that people have mused about is the rise of the gym culture. So in a desperate attempt, I think, for some people to replace community that they might have got in a youth club or a church, people have flocked to gyms, not just for the exercise, but actually just to be with other human beings. And they don't necessarily interact with them in the same way that you would in a face-to-face conversation. But it's quite clear that, for example, the rise of the Peloton and that kind of group bike exercise, I think, is a form of worship. It's not obviously religious worship, but it's a kind of communal bonding mechanism that is desperately needed to replace what technology has perhaps interrupted.
I think basically religion had this role. People dismiss religion these days. It's fairy tale. What I mean. It's all a lot of people do. They dismiss it as being fairy tale. But bottom line is what religion did. It brought people together. It was congregations, wasn't it? It was people coming together, speaking, interacting, and that shaped a lot of things about growing up, didn't it, for people?
2 things. I think, firstly, parish churches in England were actually an information dissemination tool of the Crown. So in parishes where you had a lot of people who perhaps couldn't read, and were poor, the village church was actually a mechanism for putting out information on behalf of the state. And of course, in the modern age, that's not necessary, because that discovery of information has been replaced by Google and other information sources, social media. I think the second thing is obviously science over a long period has explained the way the world works. So at a time when you might have thought the world was flat, or you were worried about being ill and what happened when you die, religion served a much greater purpose than it does now, when we think, at least, we understand so much more about the way the world works. So there are all sorts of reasons why religion has declined, but there's no doubt that it has.
Yeah, of course. I think there was a book recently by a chap called Douglas Murray about the madness of crowds. I don't know if you've heard of that one. I've read an abridged version of it. And basically, it talks about how people, when you are in a crowd, you act in a different way to what you do in a bigger crowd than you would in a smaller crowd, if that makes sense. And I think there's a lot of that going on right now, isn't there?
Well, I think you could take that into social media. I mean, going back to my point about empathy. Okay, if you started talking to people on in real life, the way some people talk to each other, on social media, and I think particularly here of Twitter, some of the sort of abuse and incredibly aggressive behavior simply wouldn't carry in a live situation, but somehow on social media it's okay. Well, I think we should be asking
It's
why is it?
cowardly, isn't it? It's cowardly.
Well, it's cowardly because a lot of people hide behind anonymity. And actually, one of my conclusions in the book is that anonymity is very bad for society. The ability of people to go onto the internet, sound off, say anything they like without any chance of any repercussion is a bad thing. And the web libertarians will be gasping at the idea that you might have to identify yourself to a social media platform. But I think you should.
Thank you for tuning in. I just want to take this opportunity to thank some of our friends. Firstly, all-round tech PR superstars Nelson Bostock. Whether you're an established technology brand or a fast-growing fintech, you need the right team behind you, a team that understands your brand, your purpose, your goals, and can really help you define your narrative and tell your story, the story that matters. These guys tick all of those boxes and more. You can find them at nelsonbostock.com. That's Nelson Bostock, with the CK on the end, .com. Highly recommended. I also want to thank Tramshed Tech. We've come down here and they've kindly allowed us to use their world-class recording studio facility down here. But they do office space, they do events. I can't recommend them enough. That's Tramshed Tech. And also a big shout out to Be Digital, who make all this possible. Be Digital enable organizations to become lean, agile, and to attract the right talent. That's bedigitaluk.com.
So, in terms of counter trends, then, okay, supposing everybody reads your book and thinks, wow, Bob's right. You know what I mean? But I'm saying that tongue in cheek. But I think if people start to realize this, okay, because this is the way it's going. I think I did some research and you were talking about how I think it was 80% of under eights
Have their own tablet.
have their own tablet, which I thought was shocking. My daughter's 6; she hasn't got her own one. But I mean, I don't intend to give her own one before she's 8. But I think 80% is a mind-boggling figure, and I think it's there's going to be consequences from that. But what counter trends should we be pushing now? What should parents be doing? Do you think?
Well, so the good news is, and we'll come back to this later, I'm sure, is that Generation Z itself recognises that it has digital overload, and happily they're starting to take steps to deal with it themselves. We should come back and talk about that later. So in relation to parents, so one very easy thing is actually just to engage with your children about what they do online. When we talk to our children, I'm as guilty of this as the next man. We tend to say, "What were you doing today?" And they'll say, "Oh, well, I went in the days when you could. I went down to the park, met John. We played football, had a game of tennis, went to the pub and had a lemonade or whatever. Came home." We don't tend to say, "Yeah, okay, but in the 3.5 hours that you were on Snapchat between 11 o'clock at night and 3 in the morning." Without prying, as a matter of interest, what did you see there, and who were you talking to, and what sort of information, what sort of issues are flying around? We just don't have those conversations, most of us, I think, with our children, and that's a mistake because they're living most of their life in the online world, not in the offline world. So that's one thing we can do is just actually physically engage. I think the second thing is we have sex education in schools, which is compulsory. Bizarrely, we don't have responsible internet use education in schools. Why is that? I can't think of a more fundamental part of the national curriculum than teaching kids how to use the internet responsibly and warning them about some of the dangers and risks in online relationships.
The education system is an entirely new one. Again, I mean, financial management should be in schools as well, given the amount of debt people are getting themselves into these days. I'm sure you probably had conversations about that in the past.
Having them right now. I mean, I think the issue of financial literacy is a big one. Happily, the government has set up something called MAPS, which is an organisation which has as one of its missions improving financial literacy in schools. And actually, the financial services community, which I represent, works very closely with MAPS to make sure that around the country, schools have good programs to help teachers to help their kids to understand the basics of household account management, what a bank account is, what income and expenditure is, how it works. So that's really important. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to a point you said about Gen Z reacting to digital overload, what they're sort of what they're doing about this right now. What have you learned from your research about that?
So one of the things I did before I wrote the book was I adopted a New Year's resolution to meet a new Generation Z entrepreneur every day, every business day. So for an hour between 9 and 10 in the morning, I would sit and listen to a pitch from a youngster. It was, by the way, always the best hour of every day. I found the kids to be excited, passionate, enthusiastic, full of ideas. A lot of them recognized when I started talking to them a little bit about my ideas for the book, a lot of them said, yep, I've had that exact experience. I've been cyberbullied. I've seen fake news. I don't like a lot of what I see on social media. In some cases, I've actually deleted my XYZ account. Different forms of social media. So they are recognizing the issues and they are starting to come up with mechanisms to deal with it. I don't think, sadly, fast enough. We're not helping them enough. But there's definitely a recognition in Gen Z itself that they need to take actions to deal with digital overload.
Were you quite surprised by that?
I was a little surprised, I suppose. But let me say this. I do think my generation is leaving Generation Z a pretty miserable hand of cards, right? Whether it is the hangover from the global financial crisis, whether it is a damaged planet, whether it's the sort of continuing global war on terror that they've had all their lives, or now whether it's loading them with COVID debt, I don't think we're leaving them, in a great place. And so if we can do one thing for them, I think it is help them understand the digital world, help them understand how to manage it better, and put them in the best possible place to make a change in society. The good news is the Generation Z cohort is incredibly focused on sorting out some of these societal issues. They believe the capitalist model is broken, that the idea that a company exists just to make profits for its shareholders is something of the past. They believe companies should have purpose, by which I mean societal purpose. And indeed, they won't work for a company that doesn't make it clear that it has a purpose that goes beyond simply the profit and loss account. So I think there is very positive news about what this generation is going to do, and society will be so different in 20 years' time.
Yeah, I completely agree. One thing as well, I'm sure, which is aligned to what we're talking about here. I heard Elon Musk was getting interviewed a couple of months back, and I think the interviewer was talking about cyborgs, and he said we're already cyborgs because we walk around with mobile phones. And what in the context of this conversation, we've got this external brain whereby we can find out anything within seconds at a touch of a button,
or simply don't even have to touch a button. You just have to speak.
Yeah,
so you think about for the younger element of Generation Z, they've never known a time when you couldn't just speak at Siri or Alexa or Cortana and ask a question and you're done, right?
So when you look at it like that, this is by a country mile the most intelligent and informed generation that has ever existed that we know about. Okay, so we've talked about what motivates them and what they want, but wow, when you were talking to these people, what did you learn from them? What do you think they're going to do sort of over the next 20 years to change the world? What sort of stood out for you?
Well, so the first thing goes back to the point I was making about societal purpose. I would say half the people that came to pitch me business ideas, about 5 minutes into the conversation, I would realize that it wasn't a business as I knew it. It was a social enterprise. It was an idea to create something that was going to solve a problem, not necessarily make money. And once that had happened for the 10th time, I realized this wasn't an exception. This was very much the way they were thinking. So that's probably one of the most striking observations. There will be more social enterprises. There will be more entrepreneurship within big companies. The whole way we work. Now, I think there's an issue, which is the following, and you touched on deep work. So there's a question. At the very time when AI is developing to the point where what you might call simple jobs will be taken over by cyborgs or robots, or by technology of one form or another, and what's left for humans at that point is more complex work. Are we at the very time when we need our new generation to be capable of focus, attention, deep thinking, deep attending, and this is kind of Cal Newport's point, are we not teaching them actually to be serial multitaskers who, like digital bees, graze on multiple sort of information honeypots, but can't actually concentrate on anything for more than 30 seconds until the next interrupting message pings them away onto the next diversion. That is a big issue, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Where's the next? You just wrote a book. Where's the next generation of authors going to come from? Because you to write a book, you know this. I've never written a book, but I remember, I know of authors who lock themselves away in country, like a shed in the middle of nowhere, so they could get away from technology, get away from everything, so they can just think and write, concentrate for long periods of time. So surely that's going to maybe there will be less people producing content at that level in 20, 30 years' time.
Well, I'd go further than that. I think a lot of youngsters have already lost the ability to read a book from cover to cover. And, if you look at the way ebooks are going, they're not going to be 350-page books like the one I've just written. They're going to be more like an article with hyperlinks. And what will happen is you'll read a paragraph and then you'll think, oh, that's interesting. And you'll dart down the hyperlink. At which point you'll, as it were, lose the track of where that paragraph was heading into the next paragraph. So I think the whole form of ebooks will be very different. The way youngsters consume, literary works will be different. It won't be sitting down with a book and reading 350 pages over a couple of days. It'll be darting in and out, grazing on sort of snack-sized paragraphs and then doing something else.
Well, actually, Bob, I tell you what I think it'll be audio. It'll be audio.
More of that for sure.
Because you can multitask while doing audio, and I think Gen Z love multitasking clearly. So I think I can see that as the future. And do you know what though? I was actually reading something recently about how we are evolved to consume information better through the ear than we are through the eye. When you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
in the last 200,000 years, or however long modern anatomical humans have existed, for the majority of that, we probably didn't have writing. So we probably did communicate information through the ear, and so it does make sense. But I mean, but then again, I get more benefit from reading in terms of it seems to increase your vocabulary better than listening. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's this benefit from reading. So I think I like a balance of the two. I don't know what you think about that.
If you look at the work of the Children's Society, and I've forgotten the name of the other organisation that basically promotes reading, they do annual surveys, and those surveys show two things. They show that book reading is at an all-time low for our youngsters in history, and secondly, they show very clear links between the amount of reading that children do and their subsequent life chances. And obviously they're negatively correlated. So that's something we should be paying attention to.
No, I agree. Absolutely. So moving back to sort of the economy and stuff then, in terms of what is going on right now and what does the next sort of, obviously we've just come out of the worst pandemic that any of us have ever experienced. There's enormous economic strife clearly ahead. I know the stock market's inflated and everything looks great right now, but I mean, potentially because of excessive money printing. We won't go down that road, but nonetheless, it just feels like that we're on the verge of a potentially difficult economic period ahead. Would you say that's fair to say, or do you have any thoughts on that, Bob?
So I'm a little more optimistic than that. I think this is a very different crisis from the one we had 10 years ago, and I think the bounce back will be faster. I think what the pandemic, and we're seeing that already actually. I think what the pandemic has done is actually accelerated some things that were going to happen anyway. So, you think about the way we shop. I mean, we're never going to go back to using shops the way we did. There will obviously some people go back to using shops. I'm not saying retail shopping is dead, but that trend towards online shopping has obviously moved ahead another 10 or 20% sort of in a year that might otherwise have taken 5 to 10 years. That probably was going to happen anyway. It's been accelerated. And so, society is going to be different, but I'm quite optimistic about the economy. I actually think the economy is bouncing back quite fast. I think government has taken very strong measures to support and, as we say, bridge, from one side of the pandemic into a recovery. And I'm quite optimistic about the next 12 months. But the stock market is a different issue. We could talk about that separately, but I'm sure at some point there will be, as there periodically is, a discontinuity. And we certainly, central banks have this conundrum of how to wean us off the habit of as you put it, printing money. In Europe, of course, the even bigger issue of negative interest rates, which I think are ceasing to have the impact that they did when they were first introduced. So I think, there are all sorts of pent up big economic issues to deal with. But I'm not quite as pessimistic as you about the economy overall.
Well, I'm cautious more than pessimistic, Bob. But given you've said that, I'm happy to take your direction on that. You're definitely more credible in terms of giving economic forecasts than I am. So I'm really glad you said that. Quickly, want to get your thoughts on something. Blockchain.com, you're an advisor. You're involved with blockchain.com. What's your thoughts on cryptocurrencies and the rise of Bitcoin over the last couple of months? Have you got any thoughts on that? Would you see a future for it?
No comment on the pricing of Bitcoin specifically.
Yeah.
But what I would say is this, that I think the development to watch is the development of central bank digital currencies. Because for some people, as you have a choice, when you have a choice between owning a currency that is backed by a central bank against one that isn't, some people are going to choose the central bank backed currency, and then the question is, what impact does that have on perhaps the outlying smaller cryptocurrencies? Where I think there's absolutely a big future for cryptocurrency is in asset-backed tokens. So, it makes perfect sense to create a token that underlying which is a share of a property of any sort, whether it be real estate, whether it be any other kind of asset or IP. So I see one of the big futures of cryptocurrency will be in asset-backed tokens. It's just it's a sort of digital version of securitization, really. Makes perfect sense. So I see that having a big future. I'm not saying there's no future for other cryptocurrencies, but I think the development to watch is how, as we get more and more central backed cryptocurrencies, how that affects the non-central backed currencies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think time will tell, and we'll see how that plays out. But what technology innovations are you most excited about right now?
Well, one that's dear to my heart, which is really at the core of the book, is a new way of identifying someone's age. So one of the issues of the internet is that we know that, notwithstanding that the social media companies tend to have a watershed of 13 as the age at which you can sign onto their platforms, in some at least attempt to keep our youngest children away from age inappropriate content. But actually, big tech companies, because the technology hasn't advanced sufficiently, are not that good at being sure whether you really are over 13 or not. And you're not required to identify yourself in any kind of through what's called hard age verification. So I'm working with a company at the moment on what's called digital multimodal dynamic private age assurance. Now, what that means is the following.
Well remembered.
If you want to sign up with a big tech company, you might be asked to provide a pic of yourself. You might be asked to record a little bit of voice. And AI, probably has a 60% probability using either of those of putting you in a broad age category reasonably accurately, right? But not accurately enough. And obviously for boys in particular, 13, you can have someone whose voice has broken, someone who hasn't, and you can get them the wrong side of that line all too easily. So what we're developing is a technology that actually sits on your phone. It's not on the big tech server. And it constantly analyzes pictures through your camera. It constantly analyzes your voice through the phone. And it triangulates between the two. And so it's not using one picture, it's using many. It's not using one piece of voice, it's using many. And it's using both, triangulated between the two. And AI there is incredibly powerful and can give you a very high probability of predicting a child's age with very high accuracy. And the exciting thing about this is it all sits on the phone and nothing needs to leave the phone other than the conclusion. So this doesn't mean that a big tech company will have to take lots of pictures of you or hear lots of your voice. Your phone, which has all this already, will analyze it within the app on the phone and simply send the conclusion to the big tech. That is a real game changer in terms of the way we use social media, or could be.
Yeah, no, it is. But when you were talking about it, privacy was screaming to me. But the more you went into it, I think obviously if the data's being contained in the phone, it's not really too much of an issue. Then, is it? I mean, what I'm saying is, do people want their phones, analyzing everything on them? But I suppose it's for a good purpose, isn't it?
What percentage of homes now have smart speakers? There is no aspect of your life, whether it be in the sitting room in front of the television or whether it's in your bedroom or your bathroom, which is not being, potentially listened to, in inverted commas, 24 hours a day. So what's going on your phone is frankly just a microcosm of that. It might be different, but it's, um, it's not really any different as long as the data doesn't leave your phone. Whereas when you speak into a smart speaker, you don't know what's happening to that data. And one of the conundrums I find bizarre is this sort of weird fascination that we have in some Western economies about worrying about what the intelligence agencies might be doing with information they pick up on us. The truth is that today, the big tech companies have way more information about us every day than the intelligence agencies would ever collect or want to collect. And they're not regulated really in the same way in terms of what they can do with it. If intelligence agencies have information, it's subject to parliamentary scrutiny. It's subject to court scrutiny. So we have our worries the wrong way around. We should be far more worried about what's happening to our data in a commercial setting than we should be in a public setting, in my view.
I kind of agree. I think I've always been quite relaxed about that, to be honest. I've always sort of, what is all the fuss about? Because, I mean, if the way I see it, if Alexa's listening to me when I'm walking around the house, then I'm going to get better adverts, better products presented to me on my phone when I open up the Alexa app or whatever, and that surely is better. I don't really care what they know about me.
Provided that's all they're doing, that will be fine, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think people have been a little bit overly paranoid with it, but then again, yeah, it's about balance, isn't it? I think the bottom line is you should have the choice, shouldn't you, to give up the data or not. I think that's the key thing.
Well, and of course, under GDPR, theoretically, you do have that choice, but most people, as we know, faced with a 47-page EULA, as they're known, which is the agreement you sign when you sign up to a platform, where you have to tick away your rights. Most people just look at it and tick the box because they either can't be bothered to read the 47 pages or wouldn't understand it if they did, because they're written in a way that they're designed to be unintelligible by most computer science graduates. So no great surprises there. So we tick away our rights too easily.
I never met anybody who's read all of that spiel on GDPR, but
well, the answer is the general counsel who wrote it probably read it, and that's probably
about
the last
it. Yeah,
question.
Absolutely. So, what is the best piece of leadership advice you have ever received, Bob, in terms of what represents your style in terms of leading people, leading teams, leading organizations? What that typifies your style?
Probably surround yourself with the very best people you can find. I mean, so one of the striking things about some organizations and some leaders is they're worried that someone better than them will take over their job. I've always seen the best leaders are those that surround themselves by people who have complementary skill sets to their own, and in some areas are definitely better than them. And then the sum of the parts, is greater. So that's, I think, the thing to focus on is just make sure you've got the very best team around you for whatever it is you're trying to do.
Great advice. And what book have you been most inspired by? I can see you're well read, and don't say your own one, but
definitely not my own one. Crikey, I don't think I could pick out a book. I mean, if you said to me what was the book that always sticks in my mind, it's Birdsong, which was Sebastian Falk's book about the men in the trenches in the First World War, which I found profoundly moving, and it was a real education. I had no idea how horrendous. And obviously, one knows at some level from films how horrendous it is, but to actually hear the story of one individual going through that experience, that was a profoundly life-changing book for me. But to pick a book is so difficult. You'd have to give me a genre. I mean, what are we talking about? Comedy? Or are we talking about, a business book or a serious book? There are just so many, so many great books.
Of course. Okay, so coming back to your book then, Bob. So I believe it's on Audible. It came out last month. Is that correct? You want to tell us a little bit about it and where people can get it?
Sure, it's on Amazon, it's on Kindle, it's on Audible. If you want the book cover to have the maximum chance of going to charity, it's on a website called www.robertwigley.uk. I basically said that I'll donate all profits from the book to adolescent wellbeing charities. There are a few of those growing up now. Couple of great ones in the UK. I mean, obviously people like the NSPCC, Young Minds do lots of work in this area. Parent Zone, I was talking to yesterday. And then in the States, they're really even better developed because I guess the problem has developed farther and faster there. And I'm actually looking at myself at whether I won't try and do some work to develop the safety tech sector in the UK. So we have a whole range of businesses growing up to try and help protect us against the worst aspects of the internet. The UK already leads the world in this area. So I'd like to, my legacy from the book, in a way, I think we'll be doing some work to try and help the safety tech companies grow as quickly as possible and put the UK on the map as a world leader in this space.
Do you have any books up your sleeve in the future then? Do you think this is the first of many?
So I don't think I would write another book. By the way, I would just say for any authors listening, I now have a much more profound appreciation of what goes into writing a book. And I'm full of admiration for you if you do this for a living. I don't know how anybody makes a living from writing books. It's incredibly hard work. I am working on a documentary. So I want to make a documentary that will be a follow-up to The Social Dilemma. The Social Dilemma was a great documentary on Netflix. It's put this issue of what's called the surveillance economy firmly on the radar, but it was ultimately told through the eyes of some sort of broadly middle-aged tech executives who've now decided they need to tell the story of their industry. It didn't really feature youngsters and their ideas, their thoughts and their solutions. And most fundamentally, it didn't have any solutions in it. It left you at the end feeling a little terrified about the state of the world. So as I have recommendations at the end of my book, I want in the documentary to explore how youngsters see the internet, what they see as good and bad, the ideas they're coming up to deal with digital overload and digital detox, and the way they want to see the world develop. That's what I want to do next. I'm going to try and work on that over the summer and the autumn.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds really exciting. I'll keep an eye out for that. And well, thanks for coming on, Bob. I've really enjoyed our chat. Probably good to wrap up. So I think, I really appreciate you coming on, and it's been a fascinating conversation. But thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed and took value from the show, then don't forget to subscribe, and also feel free to leave a review. We would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening.